The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's always a pleasure to rise in this House representing my home communities in Durham. And the last time I rose in this House on January 31st, my speech was on Ukraine, Mr. Speaker. And of course, a lot has changed since that speech, Mr. Speaker. Of course, for me and where I sit in this chamber, but more importantly, and something that has had the world transfixed, our fears about a Russian invasion were actualized. We've seen horrific videos of indiscriminate violence towards civilian populations by Mr. Putin and his Russian aggression. We've seen inspiring stories of parliamentarians, of elderly people, of people who've never held a rifle, picking one up to defend their land, to defend their community, to defend their country. So our fears have been actualized, Mr. Speaker, and when I last rose in this House, I never thought we would see the extent of aggression we see. So being back, and it's good to be back, Mr. Speaker, I want to start off by thanking all members of this House for their remarks tonight. This has been nice to see all sides coming together to stand up for our friends in Ukraine. I want to thank the government for moving on weapons for our allies in Ukraine. That was the subject of our debate a month ago, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank them for the aid that's been provided, the move alongside our allies to take Russia out of the SWIFT financial system, the restrictions on airspace. There must be a full court press of both diplomatic and security pressures brought to bear to halt this aggression and save lives, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank the government, I want to thank the Conservative opposition and all members of this House for this debate tonight. I'd also like to thank Canadians, business leaders, community and charity leaders across the country stepping up, donating, doing drives to raise awareness and raise funds to help. And particularly, I want to thank the Ukrainian-Canadian community, Mr. Speaker, who have always inspired me from my very first speech as a fledgling politician in the Dnipro Hall in Oshawa with members of the long-standing Ukrainian community there. The League of Ukrainian Canadians, the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, charities, credit unions across this country are stepping up. And I know that is providing hope. So the debate we have here tonight, Mr. Speaker, is one of unity because it's about the values we represent as a country. The commitment to liberty, to democracy, to the rule of law that we want to see our millions of friends in Ukraine have as well, Mr. Speaker. And it's been shocking to hear some of the stories. This morning I heard an interview with a Ukrainian member of parliament. She's 37, Inna Suvsan. And here's what she said, speaking to a Canadian journalist, Mr. Speaker. I'm so much better with words than with arms, but I will pick up arms if it comes to that. End quote. We're so fortunate in this House, Mr. Speaker, that we never have to worry about going beyond our words. The very fact that we see the President, we see members of all sides of their Parliament stepping up, inspiring, and even taking up arms to defend their land. It's something as Canadians we have to act and we have to be relevant within NATO, within the United Nations, within the G7, the G20, to make sure countries like Ukraine don't face this brazen aggression, this hostility of the highest order, or else we will become a world where politicians have to stop the words and pick up the arms, Mr. Speaker. And that's a scary notion. So I want Ms. Suvsan to know parliamentarians around the world, including here in Canada, are going to fight hard to make sure she can continue to fight with her words and her democracy and not have to resort to picking up arms. So in the spirit of cooperation with my words of thanks, I would like to provide two recommendations to the government in this debate. C'est un honneur pour moi, Monsieur le Président, d'être ici.
It is an honor for me, Mr. Speaker, to be here as the Member of Parliament for my hometown. I'm also a proud veteran, Mr. Speaker. We need foreign affairs policy targeted policy which is based on our country's values, our societal values, and also based on our allies, our friends around the world, including Ukraine.
Specific recommendations that I'd like to bring to the government's attention. First is we have to have a return to interest-based foreign policy. What are our interests from an economic and trade standpoint? What are our diplomatic, our humanitarian assistance interests as a nation? What are our security concerns, our defense alliances as a country? We are one of the most multilateral countries in the world because we've always had to be as a trading nation, as a nation that straddles the northern half of the Americas, Mr. Speaker, a nation born not of revolution but evolution from an empire and now stand as one of the world's great democracies. We have to have our foreign policy not based on appealing to small groups, appealing to the issue of the day. We have to make it based on our strategic long-term interests as a country and on our values as a country, Mr. Speaker. The Deputy Prime Minister, when she laid out this government's foreign policy approach in a speech in this place in 2017, she began her remarks with a question. Is Canada an essential country at this time in the life of our planet? End quote, Mr. Speaker. It then did not really lay out interests, but laid out a number of emerging issues. And we've seen that repeatedly with progressive trade agendas, with climate change and other issues outflanking our economic, our security, our trade, our diplomatic, our humanitarian interests as a country. And that has to change, Mr. Speaker, because all issues are a priority, from climate change to some of the progressive trade agenda that was promoted with the United States. But our security as a country, our relevance within NATO, within NORAD, are critical to what our country must advance. And so I would ask the government, in the spirit of cooperation we see here, to make sure that we have the equipment we need for our Canadian Armed Forces, that we arm our diplomats, our aid workers, with the tools and the funds they need to assert our interest and will around the world, Mr. Speaker. We've been lulled out of a sense of complacency. The second recommendation I would have, Mr. Speaker, relates to our Arctic, something that I've been talking about for many years, something that I was pleased to work with Michael Levitt when he was chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and we conducted the most robust examination of our interests in the Arctic in a generation. Nation building at home, vigilance beyond, preparing for the coming decades in the Arctic. An April 2019 report, it stated that the Arctic is fundamental and an indivisible part of Canada, and that right now, when we wrote it in 2019, our sovereignty is at risk. The first section of that report, Mr. Speaker, dealt with Russian military and security buildup in their portion of the Arctic, Russian interest in the continental shelf, Russian interest in polar trade and circumnavigation routes, Mr. Speaker. We are decades behind where we need to be in asserting our Arctic sovereignty. We, the North, Mr. Speaker, should be more than a hashtag that we use when we're proud of our basketball team. This defining element of our country right now is in jeopardy. So we need the ships, the drones, the personnel, the Rangers, the infrastructure investments to realize the true potential of Canada and recognize that we are a neighboring country to Russia, Mr. Speaker. We also have to, based on our national interest and a foreign policy based on that, help our friends in Ukraine. So the continued support through the winding down of the SWIFT financial system, in sanctions, including the Magnitsky sanctions brought in by my friend from Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman, we need to make sure that we have the military equipment needed for Ukraine to defend itself. And we should work within NATO to see how we can put parameters, including looking at restricting the ability for Russia to inflict more damage. and then, of course, help with refugee support, Mr. Speaker. The 1.4 million Ukrainian Canadians have helped build this country. Canada was the first nation to recognize Ukraine, and tonight, let's show as parliamentarians that we will continue to be one of the strongest, one of the most consistent, and one of the most steadfast allies of Ukraine. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Kings Hants.
To thank my honourable colleague for his remarks and his speech here tonight, and it's great to see him back in the House. Some of what my honourable colleague touched upon are actually things that are going to be in what I have the chance to say later today. But this gentleman, my colleague, has served in our Canadian Armed Forces. He has defended and protected our country, and I thank him for that. My question is, of course, actually around the military presence. The United States, indeed, we have ruled out the idea of having Canadian troops in Ukraine. Of course, the Minister of Defense has said that we will mobilize 3,500 troops to support our NATO commitments. This member served in that capacity. Could he give his thoughts to us as our colleagues in this House about what point Canada has to mobilize beyond its initial 60,000? Are we at that point in terms of our complement of Canadian Armed Forces, or do we have to be encouraging other Canadians that perhaps may take on the same profession that he did before he joined this House? Thank you.
The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member from Kings Hants for his thoughtful inquiry, and I know, like I do, he has a pride for the men and women who serve in the Canadian Armed Forces, particularly at CFB Greenwood. I was stationed at Shearwater and did a lot of training at that incredible airbase, and I think all parliamentarians are proud of any Canadian that steps up to put a uniform of service on for their country, whether service at home, which we've seen particularly in British Columbia in recent months, Mr. Speaker. But we've been also steadfast, going back to the Conservative government, Mr. Speaker, with operations like Unifier and Reassurance. We've had great collaboration within NATO, and particularly training operations in Ukraine and in the Baltics, to make sure that we have a presence. But I really do think that there's been a creeping barrage of aggression by Vladimir Putin, and we've been lulled into a sense of complacency as a Western world. Starting in 2014 with the Revolution of Dignity, Mr. Speaker, that led Mr. Putin to go into Crimea, into the Donbass. We saw the Malaysian Air Flight 17 shot down. We saw cyber attacks in 2015 that took out part of the Ukraine energy grid, Mr. Speaker. There has been a steadfast and consistent approach of aggression, and we've hoped that the post-war world order would not change. It has changed. So in the spirit of cooperation, I know that member shares an interest in our Canadian Armed Forces. We need a nonpartisan plan to build out capacity for our Canadian Armed Forces and for exerting our control over our landmass in the Arctic, which right now, even our friends in the U.S. have stepped away from the relationship Mr. Mulroney and President Reagan negotiated with respect to the Northwest Passage, Mr. Speaker. We must act now to help our friends in Ukraine, but also to make sure we defend our own territorial sovereignty.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires.
The questions and comments, the honourable member for Saint-Jean. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the colleague from Durham for his speech. He mentioned that the last time he spoke was January 31st. I also spoke on Ukraine at that time, and at that time, it was a matter of diplomacy. Several journalists raised questions about what had been going on in the government. That is, no white paper on foreign affairs, 5 different ministers in as many years. Do we need to revisit the diplomatic approach to have something more structured? Answer: thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question as well. I spoke in January on the Ukraine situation before Mr. Putin's invasion. Unfortunately, now there's a war. in Ukraine and legal war that violates international law. We need a new approach when it comes to foreign affairs as a country. As I said in my speech, we need a foreign affairs policy that is focused on our interests as a country, our economic interests, security interests, diplomatic interests. But as well, we need an approach that's focused on our democratic values. As a democratic country that has a large heart for poorer countries around the world, it's time to relaunch our diplomatic policy. Everyone should work in close collaboration here in the chamber on our priorities as a country and human rights and the Ukrainian situation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Comments? The honourable member for Edmonton Griesbach.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member from Durham. I have a serious question, and I hope that this House can unite around how important it is to ensure that we have visa-free requirements for Ukrainians seeking safety. We've heard several times today this question been posed, and I really hope that we can get some unity on this tonight. And I'd like to ask the member from Durham whether or not the Conservatives agree with the NDP's proposal from at least 2018 to ensure visa travel-free requirements for Ukrainians are waived.
Well, member for Durham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I think this is the first time I've had the chance to respond to the new member from Edmonton Griesbach, and I want to welcome him to the House and thank him for the question and remind him that Conservatives have been asking for this for many years. In fact, if I could have my friend from Selkirk Interlake Eastman whisper me how many years, it's been 4, Mr. Speaker. One thing I think we're very proud of in this House is strong, deep, historic ties between Ukraine and Canada. And the more we can facilitate those ties through parental, grandparent, family travel, through business relationships, through the free trade agreement that my friend, the honourable member from Abbotsford, helped negotiate, Mr. Speaker, these are the indications of a mature and important relationship for our country. So I agree with him. I do think that is something we need. We also need to work with allies across Europe, particularly in Poland. We've seen 500,000 people already flee. And I want to speak for a moment about someone that works on the Hill who just moved here from Ukraine a couple of years ago, a friend, Daria Fasenko. I spoke to her a few days ago. All her family are in eastern Ukraine and have had to hide out in the country away from a war being inflicted in their country. Daria is in contact every day, and like so many Ukrainian Canadians, they're worried about their family, and that's why it's so nice to see the House come together tonight. So nice to see Canada assert itself alongside our allies, and whatever we can do to help at this time of crisis, we need to do.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Sandwich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And this is an evening of remarkable consensus on all sides of the House of our support for Ukraine. And its people, and its brave and inspiring president. So I hate to find one small part of the honourable member for Durham's speech that I really do want to take up and ask him to rethink it. The notion which he may not have meant to sound as strong as it did, which was this government had spent too much time looking at things like climate change and needs to focus more on national security and the economy. But those are the same things. The climate crisis threatens national security and the economy, and as the report that just came out today from the IPCC will further inform him. But I wanted to put to him these words, which I think are hard to say too much attention on climate change when they come from Dr. Svetlana Krakowska, who is the head of the IPCC delegation from Ukraine. And today she said this, quote, "Human-induced climate change and the war on Ukraine have the same roots, fossil fuels and our dependence on them. We will not surrender in Ukraine, and we hope the world will not surrender in building a climate-resilient future. These are consistent and convergent goals, not competing." Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I would cite the report I referenced in my remarks and invite the honourable member to consult the report that our committee did in 2019, Nation Building at Home, Vigilance Beyond, Preparing for the Coming Decades in the Arctic. And climate change is part of preparing for the Arctic. In fact, at the request of the Conservatives, that Foreign Affairs report, Mr. Speaker, was the first report of a parliamentary committee prepared in the Indigenous languages of the partners we met with on the ground. That was Conservative request, Mr. Speaker, because that resilience, that vigilance we need to build in our Arctic is the Rangers for security, but it's also the impact of climate change, particularly on traditional ways of life. The challenge I have with this government is it will sometimes substitute these notions and ignore the hard and fast statecraft mechanisms that we should have. Indeed. The government completely ignored the need for us to be full partners in NORAD. That includes ballistic missile defense. It means asserting our sovereignty in the Arctic. It means supplying ships for the Canadian Armed Forces. We have to look at the world as the way it is, Mr. Speaker, and that's what I hope tonight's debate can do, to make sure Canada helps our friends in Ukraine, but make sure we're prepared at home. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.